Okay, welcome to my presentation looking at the therapeutic use and self-medicated use of image and performance enhancing drugs for therapeutic and well-being purposes. So this is based on a recent academic journal article I published with Performance Enhancement and Health. I will put the link in the description if you want to go and read it and get the full details. But this video is to give you a good overview of the content of the article, some of the key arguments and some of the key evidence which I used in the course of this creating this article. So to give a bit of background to this paper, concerns about the use of image and performance enhancing drugs have been increasing in recent years because there's been an increase in use, or at least an apparent increase in use. So quite a few different researchers now have commented on what we're seeing in terms of the use of IPEDs, their increased prevalence, and perhaps the potential public health issues which could come with the use of these drugs. So in looking at public health, one of the key areas that's been focused on is harm reduction for users. What are the particular harms which correlate with steroid use? Harms from injecting drug users, harms that steroids cause more broadly, mental effects perhaps associated with steroids, perhaps associated with withdrawals. But because there's quite a few different types of user, obviously, the specific interventions that are needed to avoid harms vary by user types. So a few typologies have been created to look at, in aggregate, which types of user engage in which types of behavior broadly, and therefore help to understand and tailor policy. So if somebody accesses a needle and syringe program or other health service, and they are aware of sort of what to look out for these different types of user and what are most likely to be their needs. So I myself have talked about this in some of my other videos, which you can check out. But broadly, this framework, which I've got on the slide here, this typology, is one that's quite often used and just breaks down user types. So those who are the sort of YOLO type, who are very focused on their image and sort of hedonistic lifestyle, and they've got very short temporal horizons, they're probably going to be less invested in becoming educated and learning to use safely long term, and so might need specific helps in those areas. Whereas the more expert types, who are very well read, have a very clear idea of the effects of these drugs, perhaps the specific interventions which they need to help them avoid harms are very different. So that gives an overview of why it's important to have some understanding of different types of user. Now, within this typology, the idea of the well-being type has been floated by a few different researchers, those who broadly use IPEDs to feel fit and healthy, and there may be a component of wanting to look good within that as well. So it's quite a large category in much of the existing research, such as Christensen et al. And Sanow et al.'s works that I've cited on the slide. So within this well-being type of user, there's a specific type of well-being use, which I think is important to look at in its own merits. And I think that those who are motivated by these well-being motivations of therapeutic use of IPEDs for repair, rehabilitation, things like testosterone replacement therapy, it's quite important to understand these as a specific subset of user. Now, there may be within the expert type or within the athlete type people who are interested in using drugs specifically for repair, or who are experts but are, got into it through an interest because they want testosterone replacement therapy. So it doesn't necessarily fit this typology perfectly. Of course, all typologies are just heuristics and can be very useful, but will inherently have limitations. But this specific type of use, I think, is quite important to look at. So there's been some recent research that's been very good at looking at this idea of IPEDs as self-medicated drug use, similar to what we see for the use of some prescription drugs. There's been some good research more broadly on the use of prescription drugs such as opioids and benzodiazepines, exploring the motivations for why people are accessing those off prescription. And similarly, Underwood et al., they did a piece exploring why men are accessing testosterone for the purposes of testosterone replacement therapy, and bringing in this real understanding of self-medicated IPED use. Now, if you've been following my work for a while, you'll be familiar. I did a presentation a few years ago, about 4 years ago, called Illicit Health, where I explored some of these ideas. So this piece that I'm presenting today is sort of bringing those ideas in line with more recent publications in the field, and a few new insights I've gained from talking to people in the time since, as well as reading this literature. So from my work, things like TRT, testosterone replacement, for the purposes of treating low testosterone, this is an important one to look at. Those who are motivated by health conditions and want to treat these through the use of steroids and other image and performance enhancing drugs which they've accessed through the black market. And of course, this extends to broader well-being and repair use. So this is quite important, because why are these people choosing to self-medicate with these drugs? Why are they accessing through the black market, and how do they go about use? This is important because, of course, black market IPEDs do pose some inherent risks to do with quality of manufacture, to do with uncertainty of dosing, to do with issues around sterility and so forth. Anyone who's read my book will know that there was an issue with a vial containing a fly from bought through one of those online pharmacy type sites. So some issues with black market IPEDs, but clearly people are using them for reasons they feel as though the risk is justified based on why they're using them. So important to understand, actually, people who are identifying this kind of self-medication or therapeutic use of IPEDs to really get an insight into their thoughts and their feelings in order to create perhaps more effective harm reduction policy for this population. So within my research, the real key areas which came up were repair and rehabilitation, which overlaps with the sort of sporting goals, as we'll see, but perhaps there's some indication it is extending into the population more broadly, a more broad understanding of well-being and therapeutic use. As well as general well-being, things which were done more broadly to facilitate a feeling of wellness, and I'll give a few examples of that. And then, of course, testosterone replacement therapy, very important topic when looking at contemporary steroid use, I believe, and perhaps something which could be rising. Certainly interest in it has been. And then important to forming policy is to look at actually how users perceive their interactions with doctors and the medical community, because when we're talking about self-medicated use, of course, many of these individuals did in fact seek help from medical professionals before using. So understanding those interactions is very important to understanding subsequent use. So let's begin with injury repair and rehabilitation, that sort of first category. Now, as I said, this sort of correlates with some of these sporting and more hardcore cultures like powerlifters and bodybuilders, and there has been some discussion of the use of IPEDs for injury repair in various texts going back some time. So in Lee Monahan's work, he talks about the use of equipoise, boldenone undecylonate, for it's considered to have repair properties. It's very good for joints. And Evans talks about the capacity for sort of physiotherapy and so on to use steroids to actually help with repair and rehabilitation. And anyone who's watched Bigger, Stronger, Faster will know it's sort of mentioned for these purposes there. I believe it was oxandrolone they were talking about in that example, which you can see on the slide I've got is Anavar, of course, same drug. So within sporting cultures, there's quite a lot of people who they use, I say sporting, I'm talking broadly powerlifting, bodybuilding, those sorts of sports, but of course in more Olympic sports as well. Although I haven't so much researched those areas as my specialism. I was going to various gyms and just talking to sort of gym-based trainers of these types of cultures like powerlifters. So those who use IPEDs for competitive purposes because they want to increase their strength, they want to be more competitive, some of them will take drugs, specific drugs, because of their repair properties. So it might be that they want to take testosterone as kind of their base, and maybe they do take some of these for size as well. Maybe they are using boldenone for size as well as repair purposes. But as you can see from this quote from Jim, he was saying that most of his IPED use was for strength gains. But I would use something every now and then therapeutically, like I use some Anavar for 4 weeks because it's got benefits for joint health. So he's seeking out specific drugs to use which aren't part of his normal strength-oriented routine of IPED use because they have these repair properties. So understanding that repair properties is a factor in some people's IPED use actually could be important to understanding those patterns of use as well, and potentially for addressing any harms. As you can see from this quote from Rich as well, some lifters, although they did use for strength purposes and because they were part of a competitive subculture, it might be that the repair motivations was actually what kind of pushed them towards using. So Rich was in this position where he was considering using. His friends with Jim, who was using at the time. So he kind of had that access, he had the opportunity, and he was getting stronger, and he felt like he wanted to use steroids to progress. But he actually says, the thing that really kind of tipped him, one of the main driving forces was the quote, for going in and doing a cycle testosterone and boldenone. What pushed him to use the boldenone was actually wanting to repair a shoulder injury. So he had this niggling rotator cuff injury and was talking to Jim, who was saying about boldenone meant to be good for it. And he says, "What do you think? Would this be good for my injury? If so, could you get me some?" Now, boldenone, of course, has quite a long half-life, but actually comparatively not very severe effects compared to some other steroids. So potentially there's some harms linked to if those long half-life drugs are kind of the ones that people are leaning towards. But it's regardless of the specific harms that could be associated, it's just interesting to note that some use within these sporting cultures, kind of one of the key underlying motivations was actually concerns over injuries. And as you can see from Rich's quote about his use of human growth hormone, which he was using a couple of IU a day, but I think cycling a few days on, a few days off, was saying about, after no longer being competitive, was still saying, look, I'm not about being the biggest or even the strongest anymore. Now I care more about my health, how I feel day to day, like my joints when I'm at work. So identifying that his continued use, now he's no longer actively competing, he's still using. And part of that might be carryover from the strength training and kind of his identity formation there. But he says actually he cares about his joints and his how he feels day to day. So very much putting him within that well-being class, even though he was training as a competitive powerlifter. And of course, that's linked to human growth hormone use, which again is one of these drugs. Perhaps it is used for size and strength, but also those who do choose to use it may have more specific therapeutic motivations in mind when they go on it. Now, what's particularly interesting when we're talking about wellbeing users is actually beyond these powerlifters and beyond the bodybuilders and those who were their subcultures were more historically associated with use, individuals who came from cultures which don't necessarily have those traditions. So Mikey was a breakdancer who I talked to, and we were just talking about my research, and he noted that actually he knew some guys who would use HGH, use a couple of IU of that to help repair dodgy ligaments, was the quote, so that they could keep on dancing as they got older. And he says some breakers sort of in their 40s, HGH was actually quite normal among them as you got into that sort of age category, because the wear and tear on your body from breakdancing was something that they were increasingly aware of, and increasingly aware that there were sort of HGH and synthetic peptides and things that you could use in order to offset some of this damage. And likewise within sort of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, there's also some growing awareness of this, although that's perhaps more closely aligned to those traditional subcultures. Given fighters, it's been a semi-common knowledge for a while. The key example you would think of, like Anderson Silva when he broke his leg, and there was a lot of discussion was his steroid use. I think that was DECA, was that to help him repair faster. But nonetheless, this spread to cultures other than sort of hardcore gym cultures like powerlifters, very interesting to pay attention to. Spread to dancers, as we can see, similar to if you track the spread of steroids in Olympics and go from the weightlifting to the sort of more strength-based field sports, and then spread out to sort of everything. If you read Waddington's book, it gives a good summary on that. But yeah, so thinking of this spread and why it would be important to understand these therapeutic motivations beyond simply, strength or size or whatever sort of sporting or image motivation. This ties in with my last presentation I gave on synthetic peptide hormones and how those are increasingly available on sites such as Amazon. So if you look at those pages, the ones which are still up, there are reviews and there are comments, and there's also similar things on blogs and social media posts talking about using TB500, CJC1295, BPC157, GHRP2, GHRP6, all these different synthetic peptide hormones that have really come into the mainstream, that were previously just somewhat niche and were referred to as research chems among powerlifters, and you had to go on like a specific pharma peptide website to access back in 2014. Now you can go on YouTube and you can type in BPC157 and you'll get videos with tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of views talking about, and this is the medical benefits and this is how it helps heal you, and you can go on Amazon and you can buy them. And I should hopefully have a piece very soon discussing the quality of some samples that we tested. I'll just do a really quick spoiler, because actually it's quite important information to get out in the public. They seem to be better quality than underground steroids or SARMs, but there's still some issues in terms of substitution and not being the purity that they are advertised as. But we'll leave that for a future presentation. But this increase in discussion of these types of drugs that you can see if you just go on Google and you can find some links, go on YouTube and find some videos. There does seem to be this spread to these other cultures not previously associated with sort of hardcore gym training. So this perhaps indicates, if I'm in the gym and I'm hearing people talk about, oh, I had tennis elbow, so I started using this drug, or I'm seeing these things on forums, this perhaps shows a need to understand, removed from gym cultures, what are the underlying motivations of well-being use. So perhaps that's a sort of next step for our understanding of enhancement drug use. Now, building on this idea you could use human growth hormone and synthetic peptides and the repair properties that they have. Actually, Rose, who I interviewed in my research, she had a very interesting story, a very telling story on this side in relation to suffering from a chronic health condition. So Rose suffered from joint hypermobility syndrome, and she was saying that she had terrible problems with her ligaments and tendons, and particularly her hands, but also her legs, her ankles especially, all kinds of problems with these. And you can see her quote that the doctors basically said there's nothing they can do and that she was just going to degenerate. So she called up her best friend And she said to me, at the time she was looking into could she have her hands removed and replaced with robotic hands because they were in agony all the time. I cut that out for brevity's sake for the article, but that was part of the broader interview. So, but her friend, being a powerlifter, sort of was aware of some of this discussion of repair properties of some of these drugs. So he thought there must be something that could help. So started looking up actually what are the best drugs for regenerating ligaments, and the upshot was that human growth hormone was probably their best bet. So Rose, she was involved in lifting. She did both powerlifting training and Olympic weightlifting training because the doctors had said to her, this might be a way to help mitigate your condition, is to build some of that strengthening muscle. And of course, that's sort of what the HGH was intended to do, was to accelerate and really help with that strengthening of the ligaments and of the supporting muscles. So when the doctors said there was nothing they could do, obviously this issue comes up. So they order some human growth hormone from a lab advertised in China. And Rose said she did get one batch, which wasn't so good. She came up in like these swollen red lumps, threw that batch away. She got a different batch, and she said this one seemed to work. And, she was comparing it to the effects of what people said they'd experienced online. She started with 2 IU, then ramped it up to 4 IU. And as you can see from the quote, she says, it made differences that literally physiotherapists and so on have looked at me and gone, you shouldn't be able to walk. How the hell are you able to do those things? Those things being compete in powerlifting. So she's gone from this position of being told that she's going to degenerate and she's in constant pain to now seemingly treated through the use of black market human growth hormone she accessed from China. And others had talked about, back injuries, using these drugs to help heal after disc herniations or other back problems or other similar chronic health conditions or severe injuries. So it does seem to be that there is an awareness of the use of image and performance enhancers to treat those kind of things. And Rose's is perhaps the starkest case because she only got into lifting as a result of being told to because of her condition, as opposed to she was already within that subculture and then started using the drugs. So it's a bit clearer, the sort of wellness underpinnings to her use. And of course, that very dramatic change that she documents there. So in terms of broader general therapeutic use, there were some cases where perhaps there's overlaps. As with sporting use and repair, there may be overlaps in terms of fat loss, could be image focused, but might also be health focused. So one of the participants I spoke to, Stephen, who was a gym owner, he used this example of one of his members who, he did tell me how much she was, but she was something like 140 kilos. And her doctor said, you have to lose weight because it's too much strain on your body. It's really, impacting on your health. So she was advised by her doctor to lose fat. And she bought clenbuterol as a result of that. So even though we tend to think of clenbuterol and fat loss as falling within image enhancement, there does seem to also be some capacity for some self-medicated use within these types of drug use. So Stephen used it actually to evidence that, his point being it's not just bodybuilders and young men who use IPEDs because on the internet it's so easy to access. So perhaps our understanding needs to account for these much broader motivations of all these people who have access to the internet and may, as a result, be accessing these drugs for well-being and therapeutic purposes. So again, talking about synthetic peptide hormones, these, as well as being used for repair, they are taken for a number of other perceived health benefits. So things like strengthening the immune system is one of the key things that turns up in the advertising of these products. And if you click back to the example on the previous page, you'll see that. But Martin is a powerlifter, but was using these drugs, and talked about actually the benefits that they offered beyond the benefits he had for steroids. So he said using GHRP, I think this was 2, it might be 6, said rehabilitation for your sleep is one of the key reasons to use it. Says, I felt amazing, my sleep was amazing, and my irritable bowel syndrome also cleared up when I was on GHRP, another effect attributed to those drugs. So as you can see, although Martin is a powerlifter and is interested in gaining strength, he's also engaging in this broader general well-being use for sleep and for irritable bowel syndrome, as well as joint repair and all those sorts of things that come with synthetic peptide use. And again, those now being very openly promoted on sites like Amazon and being openly discussed on YouTube, on social media, and so forth. So as with sort of the growing use linked to repair and rehab that we discussed, is there perhaps a growth in use of, whether it's synthetic peptide hormones or even things as simple as fat burners and clenbuterol for general well-being purposes? And of course, this could be linked to the sort of increasing pharmaceuticalization of daily life. This much broader wellness culture and how we have drugs for all sorts of things. And we have all kinds of different supplements for sleep, for mood, for cognition, alpha male vitality, that sort of thing. Perhaps this can be situated within those broader discussions. So, of course, this also intersects with sports, as I've noted. And just as with injury repair in sport, it's also interesting to think about IPEDs for broader well-being when engaging in sporting activities. So CB was a Brazilian jiu-jitsu and mixed martial arts fighter who I spoke to, and he talked about actually how some use of IPEDs, and particularly testosterone, that was actually to offset the negative health impacts that training could have, because really hard training and fighting itself as well, but particularly training camps, can actually be quite destructive to your body, can take quite a toll on your body. And he compared it to cycling and Tour de France, where there's been some work done previously. And he said, you train 8 hours a day and your body just can't keep up. So if you can take this stuff when you're training full time and pushing your body to the limit, it's healthier for you to have more testosterone, to have more red blood cells, so that you don't get that real negative crash. And of course, TJ Dillashaw is a great example of somebody who said, he admitted he took EPO, Hemocrit, I think was the brand name for it, which you can get on prescription. And he took that because he said, when I was trying to cut weight, the toll on my body was so much and I was so anemic that I took that to offset those negative effects. Now, obviously, it had a performance enhancement effect as well, but that does give an idea that there is this understanding in the sort of culture of fighting more broadly that actually, training camps can have this severe negative impact, and some drug use can help offset that. And as I said, sort of Joe Rogan's discussed that on his show. I know Dana White's referenced it. Now, it's also interesting because in my polydrugs presentation, when I was talking about opioid use, I cited that Mariusz discussed in wrestling that using boldenone and testosterone and growth hormone, those in part helped keep him off opioids, because in wrestling, constant on season, you're getting hurt every time you go out there and you're constantly in pain. And he said this kind of helps you get through the pain. So a lot of the guys use opioids for those purposes, but he was saying actually the steroids themselves can help you with that. They can help you feel less pain and help you feel more repaired, more rested, faster. So this does seem to be a thing within sports. But of course, competitive users, they are already considered, they are really focused on in a lot of policies, perhaps too much on the prohibition side, and maybe there needs to be a greater look at harm reduction side. And I think these arguments really help highlight that you can advocate for prohibition of these drugs, but in the cases where these guys are using them because they feel as though it would be harmful not to. Not that there isn't, of course, there's performance enhancement benefits as well, but perhaps the health aspect needs to be accounted for in those discussions as well. So coming to the big topic of testosterone replacement therapy, obviously quite a lot of interest in this topic over the past, say, 7-8 years probably. Really something that has built up, and I would say, from the time I sort of went into the field formally in 2013, that's when it was really taking off. Of course, I've been training in gyms for a few years before that, 2010 in like serious powerlifting gyms. But TRT, it's becoming this key area of focus among drugs researchers, because I think we're becoming increasingly aware that this seems to be one of the big trends, one of the big things that people in gym cultures are talking about, even those who are motivated by like strength and competitive motivations or image motivations. So TRT is it's linked to these well-being aims of concerns over this idea of the male menopause in older men, or low T as a chronic health condition that might need treating. And you can see adverts on social media popping up asking, do you have low T? Various things getting shared discussing testosterone and its effect on your body, shared all over Twitter and other social media. But what's very telling about TRT and why I think it's important is you will note, and this has been around for a few years now, guys just talking about steroid use will use the term TRT dose just to mean low testosterone dose. So it's so kind of ingrained, the awareness in the culture. Everybody just knows what TRT is. So if a guy's talking about his cycle and he says, yeah, I'll do a blast and I'll use test and tren or whatever in however many milligrams per week, and then I'll drop it down to a TRT dose. That's well understood. That just means a low dose of testosterone. So there's this real thing in the culture, and some of my sort of contemporaries, Nick Gibbs and Barney Zukata, have also noticed this in their research with quotes of people talking about TRT doses when blasting and cruising, or just sort of sustaining in Nick's work on during the lockdowns and so forth. So it's interesting, this growing awareness. Clearly, TRT is quite a prominent thing among gym cultures, those interested in going to the gym. So some people who use, say they use TRT, of course, it is for sort of enhancement and optimization purposes, and Underwood et al. In their piece talk about this idea of optimization. But some of it is sort of this actually therapeutically motivated belief in, I am self-medicating for low testosterone. And I saw this in my research in relation to older men who, when their testosterone levels were dropping, wanted to offset this so that they would feel healthier, so they would enhance their wellness and feel as they did when they were younger. And also with men who suffered from depression, fatigue, lack of motivation, lack of drive, brain fog, all of which was attributed to symptoms of low T. So for the first of those groups, going back to gym owner Stephen, who owned a fairly big establishment. He actually owned a few gyms, to be fair, but not the sort of big national chains or international chains. But he talked about not allowing steroid abusers in his gym, but the need to distinguish use from abuse. So he used TRT when illustrating this, and I think this is a very interesting quote because of who he identifies in it. So he says, I classify steroid abuse as when a person is doing irreparable harm, completely the reverse of TRT. TRT is steroid use for a benefit. One of the top surgeons in the region, a member of my gym, has used steroids and growth hormone for 10 years, as long as I've known him, and he's obviously a top specialist, knows everything about medicine. He's over 50 and basically chooses it for quality of life. So here we have somebody who is an established, well-known surgeon, fully qualified medical professional who uses steroids and growth hormone himself and is openly talking about it to this gym owner and says, he's using it for quality of life purposes. So someone who is likely to be very informed, making the choice that actually with his natural testosterone dropping, he should be using these drugs to kind of offset that. Now, Robert, who was a physiotherapist, he also had a similar stance to this, where he was against steroid abusers. And in our discussions, he would talk about some of the idiots in the gym who clearly weren't using intelligently, who were having all these different problems, but actually was always quite accepting of the guys who were very knowledgeable and understanding of use. But he began to use testosterone himself in his 40s because he rationalized, he had gotten out of shape, he had put on more weight, he was feeling a lot more sluggish, struggling a lot more in his daily life, and he attributed that to his testosterone levels declining in his 40s. So he began just taking a low dose of testosterone in order to offset that and allow him to get back in the gym and train, lose the excess weight, but very much frame this through this kind of health and well-being perspective and wellness at work. So, and Robert also noted some of the older members, other older guys in the same gym. He knew them and he knew that they bought, and his supplier actually was this guy, Big Steve, who had used IPEDs for competitive bodybuilding, was a well-known bodybuilder, but actually in the years since had gone down to apparently, he said, just using testosterone and just doing a TRT dose. He still looked pretty big to my eye, but that's so that shows sort of how there's some intersection of guys who had never used before, just using it because they got older, versus some guys who had used competitively and then said they came off the other drugs and were just using testosterone because they were now just focused on well-being purposes. So very interesting, those different groups within the sort of older gym users, and to learn that there were sort of a few about in the gyms I was visiting among the older guys. Among the younger men, the main thing that was raised was low testosterone being a cause of depression, of chronic fatigue, and of these other negative symptoms in young men. So this links back to this growing awareness that Johnny, with whom I spoke, he was in his late 20s at the time, sort of mid to late 20s, when I interviewed him a few years ago. He talked about how he had just really struggled with brain fog, with motivation, with drive, with getting to work, with getting things done, with going to the gym and training. And he said he'd done a lot of research, and he was certain that this was linked to low testosterone. And he ate really well, really cleanly, tried to keep his diet on point to increase his testosterone levels and so forth. But he thought actually that he needed to take testosterone to offset this. So he tried talking to the doctors and was unsuccessful at getting prescribed TRT, which is sort of a recurring theme among the younger men, that they're not able to get it prescribed, particularly for these types of symptoms. So he started talking to his friends at the gym to see who could get him black market testosterone. And one of them was about to go to Vietnam and was talking about sending some back. Another had a friend in Egypt, and another was friends with Jim, who we mentioned earlier, who could potentially have sorted some things out. So he was asking around the gym trying to get testosterone at the time I interviewed him. But he said, he wanted to get it on prescription. He had tried to get it on prescription, and he wasn't going around asking these guys for steroids because he wanted to, be the biggest, most aesthetic guy. He just wanted to restore balance because he'd had these symptoms come on, and he wanted to restore, feeling how he felt before. And he said, I wouldn't try stacking it with anything, like Dianabol, just test. That's literally all I want, just to boost my natural test levels. And he had actually bought from a supplement shop before, Superdrol, and had really bad experiences with that. And he said, no, I definitely don't want to use that type of enhancer because I know I get bad side effects, but I do want testosterone for its therapeutic value. So Johnny wasn't looking for this sort of massive supralogical enhancement. He just wanted to feel well and use testosterone to achieve this based on what he had researched. And my digital research going on forums and so on, actually I turned up quite a lot of similar concerns. Young guys who said, they were constantly tired or they were constantly depressed and they had no drive, had no motivation, turning to illicit IPEDs as therapy, and some of them saying, wow, my life turned around. Now, again, for some of these cases, maybe that's because they then started going to the gym and getting in a proper routine and being able to train, that elevated their mood, and they were, suffering from depression before. But a lot said it was the use of the testosterone itself. Now, a particular case where we see that is in relation to Dean. So Dean actually was a steroid homebrewer, and he also was quite prominent on a forum and actually advised guys on how they should be accessing and how they should be brewing up drugs and so forth. So he contacted me after watching my steroid brewing video on this same channel. You can check that out if you haven't seen it already. But he explained how he kind of got into underground test brewing and use, and the importance of TRT to him. So Dean said, I'll just read this out because I think it's quite powerful. I had all the symptoms of low T: no energy, brain fog, depression. I had a total T of 310 nanograms per deciliter, and that didn't meet the cutoff for treatment. So I wasted 10 years of my life dragging at work and sleeping many hours with no energy. At breaking point, I was suicidal. I had no drive, couldn't focus at work, but the doctors still wouldn't treat me. I had a friend that introduced me to the UGL world, and I started down this path. I now feel drastically better with no desire to take my own life, thanks to getting my energy back and being able to enjoy my life again. Big muscles mean nothing to me. Anabolic androgenic steroid use is really about the CNS effect. This stuff saves lives. I'll admit I have used and will continue to use other steroids as I find the perfect cocktail to make myself feel fantastic. So Dean had previously been a cyclist, had done amateur cycling competitions, and I had asked him, was there any sort of overlap with the competitiveness, or was there anything to do with, aesthetic enhancement? And that's where that third quote on the slide comes from. He said, no, it's absolutely not. It's just, this is what makes me feel good. This is what makes me feel well. And in contrast to previously, where he had been suicidal and had no focus, he said testosterone just turned his life around. So understanding this type of self-medication and use based on, this feeling that actually I need this drug to enhance my well-being, to enhance my life. Very important to understand, and is perhaps more in line, as I said, with self-medication of prescription drugs like benzos and opioids that we see elsewhere, cannabis being a major one, self-medication, medicinalized cannabis, rather than the sort of enhancement that we see for image and sporting purposes elsewhere. So thinking about this idea of self-medication, why were users choosing to self-medicate? And I've sort of given away some of the major motivations in the past couple of slides, but still important to consider this question. So black market drugs, as we noted, associated with sort of various risks to do with poor quality, to do with substitution, not knowing the precise dosage you're using, and so forth. So really, if we want to talk about harm, use of black market drugs, and again, not having the sort of information that you would get with legitimate prescription drugs of precisely how much to use and how to go about using this, and being assured of the quality, really important to focus on. Why do users feel the need to go to the black market? So at times this could be convenience. So Rich, we talked about using Boldenone. He already knew somebody who was using it himself and was selling it, so perhaps that was partially convenience, and being within sort of a competitive subculture was getting good advice anyway. Val, who just went on the internet, just typed in sort of fat burners and ordered clenbuterol. It's quite convenient to not have to go to a doctor. There's also the price factor for those outside of the UK. If you're living in the United States, for example, it's much cheaper to, particularly if you're doing as Dean did and homebrewing, it's much cheaper to buy raws and homebrew them than it is to get a prescription, even absent the other issues. But those other issues are actually more important. So a recurring theme was actually that doctors didn't take concerns seriously. And when these individuals would go and ask for treatments and ask for help, they just felt like their doctors completely dismissed them, and they wouldn't even explain why they wouldn't prescribe testosterone. They just completely shut the conversation down. So Johnny, in discussing what happened when he went and got his hormone panel test, and the doctor said, no, it's normal, we're not going to prescribe you testosterone. Now, he had done the research online, as he said, so he asked, well, can I see the results? Because they said they're normal, but he had seen cases like Dean's. Dean was saying, they told me it was 310, which was normal, which is actually right on the bottom end of normal, and for a guy in his 20s, not actually normal at all, just falls within this kind of arbitrary range, but is actually, the sort of testosterone of a man in his 50s or something rather than 20s. So Johnny highlighted this. He said he asked, and the doctors never showed him the numbers. And he said, I want to see the numbers, because it could be, what is it, 300 to 1200 is the normal range? It's a massive range. So if he was right on the bottom of it, that would mean, yeah, okay, he falls within that range, but he's clearly far below average testosterone. And he said they just flat out refused to tell him the numbers, wouldn't show him the test results. So that is sort of what drove him to say, okay, they do not care. Doctors just not worth dealing with, and going to the gym and trying to get it on the black market. And this negative perception of the medical establishment returned again. So in Dean's example, he said, personally, he was rejected by the doctors because he was just about in what's considered the normal range, but is actually very low for a man of his levels of exercise and age and so forth. And he said he clearly had these symptoms, but still couldn't get prescribed. And he said, he's a senior figure on a forum, and he's advising all these guys who come to him. And he says there are countless men that can't get testosterone from their doctor, even though they need it. Suicide due to low T is a real problem, but the medical community thinks you need a psychiatrist and antidepressants. So they're sort of too stuck in their ways, their ideas about, well, this is how we treat these symptoms, and won't even consider, actually, maybe we should be prescribing these alternatives, or at least explaining in cases where they don't, hey, here's why we don't think that's the most appropriate option. And in Rose's case, this again, I said Rose's case was a really important one for understanding this type of use, but she had these real problems with medical professionals in terms of trying to get HGH treatment as well. So before she ordered the drugs from China, she said the first thing I did was go to my GP and ask if there was any way they would refer me for HGH treatment. And they said, we don't use that for that. We just completely dismissed her. And she said, well, the NHS does actually give out HGH for certain treatments, but they just wouldn't accept that it might help in her case. And as we saw, after she used it, she said, the effects were so dramatic, everybody was just amazed. Now, what made her particularly angry was they kept prescribing her opioids, and they would just give her boxes and boxes of opioids. And she said she was on, sort of 5 or 6 tramadol a day normally, and it could go up to 10 a day trying to manage the pain. And they were happy to prescribe her this. And when she said, it was getting too much, she didn't want to be on tramadol anymore, they said, oh, we could give you tapentadol instead, which is just another opiate. So she sort of complained about this. And the idea, the NHS were happy for her to be a state-sponsored smackhead, was her words, and that can link to sort of IPED users and stigma of other drug users, which has been covered by, Ross Coomer and Leslie Simmons and so forth. But just shows her position. You're happy to give me all these opiates, but you won't try this possible treatment, which could actually help with offsetting the damage this condition is doing. So importantly, even after she had ordered this HGH from China, used it for a few months, was able to show the improvements, and bear in mind she was going to the gym and was able to sort of start lifting and tracking how much she could lift now, as we saw in the quote earlier about physiotherapists saying, how can you do this? You shouldn't even be able to walk. She went to her pain management specialist and she showed them the log, and she said, this is what I've been taking, this is how much I've been taking and when, and this is, this is how my pain levels feel, this is, what I've been able to achieve. And she said they just immediately shut her down, like said, that's really bad because it's illegal, you shouldn't be doing that. And she said, but look, it's working. And no, they just weren't hearing it. And I've got the full quote in the article. But she just said she couldn't believe that someone in that type of position would just completely dismiss her like that, wouldn't even consider that, oh wow, HGH seems to be working for you, seems to be helping with that ligament repair and then building that that supporting muscle to help strengthen the ligaments. So in both of these cases, actually, these participants have really highlighted that they felt doctors were too focused on certain drugs as a solution, whether antidepressants or opioids, and actually that meant that they were unwilling to entertain what could be better alternatives, which really links to the sort of medicinal cannabis and psychedelics debates. Doctors are happy to prescribe drugs which are perhaps more harmful in terms of opioids, whereas cannabis might be better for some people's pain relief. And Rose is another one of these individuals, as well as HGH. She said she tried to cut out her opioids and just smoke cannabis instead, because she just thought, I'm going to wind up dead taking as many opioids as I am. So really strong parallels with those debates as well. So what are the implications of this research and these different examples, these sort of case studies I've presented you with? It's clear that some IPED use is for therapeutic purposes, and actually that these users might differ somewhat in their motivations to some of the more traditionally understood categories of user, even where they do overlap, as in the example of some of the sporting users that we've considered. It's very clear that growing awareness of testosterone replacement therapy and sort of other well-being applications of these drugs, as in the case of breakdancers using HGH and so forth, this indicates that actually this could be an increasingly important category of use to study, because even though right now image enhancement, aesthetic enhancement seems to be the main thing, actually if more groups are becoming aware of these sort of therapeutic forms of use, perhaps actually as a percentage of users they will grow significantly. And there's already indication that sort of broad well-being, which encompasses looking and feeling good, that might already be one of the larger categories of use. So perhaps as these ideas spread, they'll become even more prominent in future, and therefore important to focus on in terms of harm reduction policy. This becomes increasingly important to think about in the growing availability of things like the novel synthetic peptides that we've covered. If these are being used by non-traditional categories of user, those users who traditionally took these drugs and other IPEDs like steroids, they had culturally embedded systems of harm reduction advice, where if you go to buy something, the person selling it will make sure you're aware of what you should be doing, how to use safely, or your peers will let you know in advance, or they will strongly encourage you to do your own research. As you see on forums, people say, oh, where can I source this? And they immediately get told, lurk more, make sure you've done your due diligence, make sure you know what you're doing before you buy anything, right? If there's an increasing sort of availability of these drugs and increasing awareness of their well-being applications, are people completely removed from those subcultures and those spaces going to start using? And what are the implications of that for harm reduction? And within that, it's worth thinking about normalization. So Rose talked about how, because she was already using illicit HGH, she couldn't compete in tested lifting federations, couldn't compete in Olympic weightlifting. That meant that actually once she was going into untested powerlifting federations against other women who were using steroids, she just said, okay, well, maybe I'll start taking Anavar now to make me a bit more competitive. So does this well-being use, when it's done off prescription, does that in some ways encourage further use? And when we're thinking about these well-being type users, if there are these products like Hydropharm Unbreakable or whatever, these pills which say they contain BPC 157, does that then sort of normalize further use of enhancers? And sort of Ian Bordley's done some work on supplements and enhancement. So it might also intersect with some of those debates and discussions, which again could be relevant to our understanding of use and harm. More clearly, I think, in terms of importance, research points to a need for education and training for doctors, specific training on how to deal with patients who ask for IPED treatments. There's been some work quite recently, some really recent publications that actually have looked at what are the kind of things that we need, the information we need to be giving to doctors and healthcare practitioners so that they can deal with those who are using IPEDs. And that's looked at some of these sort of broader harm reduction areas and the concerns that these users are likely to have. But maybe just an understanding that actually people might be requesting testosterone treatments and so forth. And if you, as a professional, don't feel that that's appropriate, you need to explain to them precisely, okay, here is what your actual level is, and here's why I don't think it's appropriate. Because otherwise you're just pushing them to the black market. And when that happens and there's this clear dismissal, actually that can create harms, not only because it pushes them onto unregulated non-prescription product, but also because it creates distrust. So those users, if they experience harms from using this unregulated product, aren't then going to say, oh, I should go and speak to my doctor about this. I'm a bit concerned about this, because they've already perceived doctors to be completely antagonistic to their interests and don't trust them. And of course, prior research looking at IPED users' interactions with doctors has identified there's a lot of distrust and they feel doctors are oppositional. And it's very clear in these cases where people have asked for treatments and have just been dismissed and feel that they haven't been taken seriously, that actually this leads to them just not trusting doctors, which, given that's been identified as a big harm in relation to IPEDs, just the unwillingness to access services, I think that's very, very important to look at as an implication of this research. So that's sort of one of the key takeaways, education of healthcare professionals, but also worth considering if we are moving into this sort of a more pharmaceuticalized wellness culture, and there is more understanding of, oh, can I take these drugs to optimize my well-being? Do we want to consider increasing access to legitimate forms of the product as a means of reducing harm? So we have products that you can get just through pharmacies now, and you can't buy. Pseudoephedrine being a great example. Sudafed, you can only buy actual pseudoephedrine containing Sudafed from a pharmacy. You have to go up and ask for it, and they only let you buy 12 pills at the time. That's a means of restricting it so that you can't do harm. And there's some broader sort of political nonsense about pharmaceutical companies underpinning that as well, but we won't get too bogged down in that. Jeffrey Tucker wrote a piece on it years and years ago. But that's one thing that's being done with certain drugs. Is just, hey, we can make them available for treatments through pharmacies specifically, and that way we can ensure A, product quality is good, and B, that appropriate information is given out at the time of purchase and people know how to use these drugs safely. So Matthew Dunn and his colleagues have talked about that in a recent paper for International Journal of Drug Policy, and that's probably worth checking out if this is a topic that interests you. So that's the summary of the paper. Please go and read the whole thing if you have access. I know that academic publishing is a bit of a nightmare with all these different paywalls and things. And hey, leave a like and a comment to help, promote the video, get it into the algorithm and so forth. And, I'll try and respond to any questions which come up in the comments. But thank you very much for watching.